In the 1980s, Japan looked unstoppable. Factories roared day and night. Ships left harbors filled with cars and electronics stamped made in Japan. Sony, Panasonic, Toyota, Honda, the names were global synonyms for excellence. From Walkmans to microchips, Japan's products didn't just compete, they dominated. And with that dominance came confidence, the kind that makes nations believe they've rewritten the rules. Tokyo became the beating heart of a new world order. Investors called it Japan Inc., a seamless partnership between government, banks, and corporations. The world envied its discipline, its precision, its growth. From 1950 to 1990, Japan's economy grew at an average of nearly 10% a year. The nation rebuilt from ashes to empire in one generation. It was the greatest economic comeback story in modern history. By 1989, Japan wasn't just rich, it was the richest. The Tokyo Stock Exchange accounted for more than 40% of global equity value. The Imperial Palace grounds in Tokyo were said to be worth more than all the real estate in California. And people believed it. The media declared Japan had discovered a new capitalism, patient, collective, and unbeatable. While the West chased quarterly profits, Japan invested for decades. While others borrowed, Japan saved. While others speculated, Japan planned. But beneath the brilliance, something fragile was forming, a belief that prices could never fall, that the future would always mirror the past, that growth itself was guaranteed. That belief, as every empire learns, is the most dangerous illusion of all. The seeds of collapse were planted in triumph. By the early 1980s, Japan's economic miracle had transformed the world. Its exports, cars, electronics, steel, floriculture, flooded global markets. Its trade surplus with the United States was enormous. Factories in Detroit stood silent while ships from Tokyo unloaded millions of Toyotas and Sonys. In Washington, the message was clear. Japan's success had become America's problem. In September 1985, 5 nations met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City: the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Behind closed doors, they reached a secret agreement. The US dollar would be deliberately weakened, and the Japanese yen, along with other currencies, would rise. For America, the goal was simple: make US exports cheaper, shrink the trade deficit, and cool domestic anger toward Japan's economic invasion. For Japan, the goal was diplomacy, not disaster. Agreeing to the Plaza Accord was a show of cooperation, a gesture to preserve its alliance with the West. But it was also a trap, one that would change the course of Japan's future. Almost overnight, the yen surged in value. In 2 years, it doubled against the dollar. Japan's exporters, the same companies that had built its miracle, were crushed. Factories closed, profits vanished. And to soften the blow, Japan did what central banks always do when pain hits. It flooded the system with cheap money. Interest rates plunged. Credit became effortless. And what began as rescue quickly turned to mania. The newly rich speculated in everything: land, stocks, even golf club memberships. In Tokyo, property values tripled between 1985 and 1990. A single square meter in the Ginza district sold for more than $200,000. A generation believed the new Japan could never fall. Banks lent freely, backed by soaring real estate. Corporations borrowed to buy land, not to build. Ordinary citizens invested their life savings into an economy that had turned speculation into virtue. It was the illusion of prosperity, growth without productivity, wealth without foundation. At the height of the bubble, the total value of Japan's real estate was estimated to be greater than that of the entire United States. The illusion was so complete, people joked that the Imperial Palace grounds in Tokyo were worth more than all the land in California. And no one laughed. When the Bank of Japan finally tried to tighten the reins, raising rates in 1989 to stop the madness, it was already too late. The market that could only rise suddenly couldn't. Within months, stocks collapsed. Within years, land values cratered. And Japan, once the model of efficiency, became a monument to overconfidence. The bubble hadn't been random. It had been engineered by policy, by pride, and by a world order that demanded Japan pay for its success. The Plaza Accord was supposed to fix a trade imbalance. Instead, it broke an economy. When the bubble burst, it didn't make a sound. There was no panic, no riots, no crash on live television, just silence. The Nikkei slipped, then slid, then fell off a cliff. By 1992, it had lost more than half its value. Property prices followed. Apartments that once cost millions were suddenly worth half, then a quarter, then nothing near the mortgage attached to them. And yet the buildings stood tall, bright, clean, empty. A nation of builders suddenly had nothing left to build. But Japan didn't collapse like Weimar's Germany or crumble like Rome. It froze, and that made it worse. The first instinct of Japan's leaders was denial. To admit the scale of the losses would mean admitting that the miracle was an illusion. So the government and the banks did what humans always do when the truth is unbearable. They buried it. Bad loans were hidden behind good accounting. Developers rolled over debt again and again, pretending projects were still alive. Banks refused to foreclose, not out of mercy, but out of fear. They knew that if one domino fell, the entire system would collapse. So they propped up the dead. Dead loans, dead companies, dead confidence. Japan entered what economists later called the zombie era. Thousands of unprofitable firms, propped up by endless credit, continued to operate, producing just enough to survive, but not enough to grow. And as the walking dead filled the economy, the living stopped moving. Deflation is not just falling prices, it's falling hope. Every year in the 1990s, prices in Japan drifted downward, just a little, but enough to change behavior. When prices fall, people wait. Why buy a car today if it'll be cheaper next year? Why invest in a business if customers are shrinking their budgets? This waiting became habit, and habit became paralysis. Japan's economic growth, once 10% a year, fell to zero. Wages stagnated, promotions vanished. The lifelong employment system, the promise that had defined the salaryman's identity, began to crack. A generation that had been raised on ambition began to live with caution. Graduates became freeders, part-time workers with no security. Small shops closed, factories downsized. And across the nation, a quiet despair settled in. The kind that doesn't make headlines, but seeps into every dinner table conversation. The government tried to fight it. They launched one stimulus package after another. Roads, bridges, tunnels, spending trillions of yen. They cut interest rates to zero. They printed money before quantitative easing even had a name. But every measure treated the symptom, not the cause. Because the real disease wasn't lack of money. It was lack of trust. No one wanted to borrow. No one wanted to lend. No one wanted to spend. And so the money, printed in Tokyo, just sat in vaults idle, sterile. Economists called it the liquidity trap. But for ordinary Japanese families, it wasn't theory. It was life. Fathers who had once felt secure in corporate hierarchies now came home early, ashamed of pay cuts they couldn't prevent. Mothers learned to stretch yen like elastic. Young people began postponing marriage, and children, not out of rebellion, but realism. A culture that once equated diligence with reward now began to question whether effort mattered at all. When an economy collapses, the first tool leaders reach for is money. And Japan reached for it again and again. Through the 1990s, the government unleashed a storm of stimulus. Highways that led nowhere, bridges that connected nothing, parks, tunnels, dams, projects designed not for utility, but for activity. Anything to make the numbers move again. Between 1992 and 2000, Japan announced more than 10 stimulus packages totaling hundreds of trillions of yen, the largest peacetime spending effort in modern history. Each one was greeted with optimism, and each one faded like smoke, because you can't spend your way out of disbelief. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates to near zero. It introduced policies the world would later call quantitative easing. It flooded the banking system with liquidity. And yet, the money just sat there, frozen, like blood that no longer circulates. The banks, crippled by bad loans, refused to lend. Corporations, fearful of risk, refused to borrow. Households, burned by the crash, refused to spend. The economic machine was plugged in, but no one dared to turn it on. Then came the cruel irony. The government's rescue, meant to save the system, ended up protecting the weakest parts of it. Banks that should have failed were bailed out. Companies that should have gone bankrupt were kept alive. And so the nation filled with what economists began to call zombie banks and zombie firms. These weren't metaphors. They were literal economic corpses, kept alive by zero interest rates and government guarantees. They employed people, paid wages, and produced goods, but they contributed nothing new. No innovation, no growth, no renewal. A society that had once prided itself on discipline now found itself addicted to delay. Every bailout bought time, but time itself became the addiction. And underneath it all, one truth echoed through the corridors of power. The system had chosen stability over recovery. It was safer to stand still than to fall again. But in standing still, Japan forgot how to move. The lost decade wasn't just about numbers, it was about people, and the quiet divide that formed between those who were saved and those who were sacrificed. For debtors, the era was merciful. Loans were rolled over indefinitely, interest payments stayed low, mortgages that should have destroyed families were quietly extended, renegotiated, forgiven. The state shielded those who owed, but for savers, the cautious, the disciplined, the elderly, the punishment was relentless. Their life savings, once a symbol of virtue, now earned almost nothing. Bank accounts yielded interest so small it barely filled a postage stamp. Meanwhile, deflation meant that every yen hoarded grew heavier with uncertainty. Imagine working 30 years, saving faithfully, only to discover your reward was stagnation. The middle class, the pride of post-war Japan, began to dissolve. Young people became the lost generation, unable to find full-time jobs, drifting between part-time work and underemployment. Marriage rates fell, birth rates collapsed, the nation began to age faster than any in history. Japan's economic problem quietly became a demographic time bomb. Fewer workers, more retirees, more debt, less growth, a slow mathematical suffocation, and yet not everyone suffered. Large corporations with government ties survived comfortably. Politicians maintained order. The stock market, though depressed, still rewarded the well-connected. Foreign investors eventually bought Japanese assets at bargain prices. The crisis became unequal by design, a society where the system bent to protect institutions, but left individuals to fend for themselves. For ordinary citizens, the tragedy wasn't collapse, it was endurance. Year after year, doing everything right, working, saving, obeying, only to find the system refuse to reward effort anymore. And when a nation stops believing that effort matters, it begins to lose something deeper than growth. It loses meaning. For a long time, the world looked at Japan's lost decade as a warning, but not a prophecy. Only Japan could make that mistake, economists said. Too cautious, too risk-averse, too bureaucratic. But slowly, quietly, the same pattern began to reappear elsewhere. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, Western governments copied Japan's playbook almost line for line. Zero interest rates, massive bailouts, quantitative easing on a scale no one had ever imagined. At first it worked, or seemed to. Markets rebounded, housing recovered, politicians congratulated themselves for saving the system. But beneath the charts and headlines, something eerily familiar was happening. Banks were rescued, but productivity lagged. Debt ballooned, but wages stagnated. And an entire generation entered adulthood believing growth was something their parents had, not something they would see again. In Europe, zombie companies multiplied. In America, cheap money inflated stocks and real estate instead of wages. And in China, the rising superpower once hailed as the new Japan, the story grew even stranger. Chinese cities built entire districts of skyscrapers that no one lived in. Developers borrowed billions on borrowed billions. Apartments were sold before the foundations were poured. Construction cranes dotted horizons like forests of steel. The illusion was familiar. Assets rising, debt growing, everyone pretending it would last forever. When Japan's bubble burst in 1990, people said it was a once-in-a-century event. But look around. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern. Debt-driven growth always ends the same way. First with pride, then with denial, then with silence. And that silence, the stillness after the boom, is what the world fears most. Japan's lost decade never truly ended. It stretched into a lost generation, and now, for some, a lost lifetime. The streets are safe, the trains run on time, the lights still shine in Tokyo's towers, but behind the order lies an emptiness, an economy that runs but no longer races, a society that survives but rarely dreams. That's the haunting beauty of Japan's story. Collapse didn't come with fire or famine. It came with routine, with days that looked the same, with ambition slowly dimming like neon fading in the rain. And yet, while Japan learned to live with stagnation, another giant followed its path. And this time, on a scale far larger. Across the East China Plain, whole cities rise where no one lives. Glass towers shimmer in the sun, but their windows reflect only wind and dust. Developers keep building because the system demands motion, even if the motion leads nowhere. Sound familiar? When debt replaces demand, when concrete replaces confidence, when cranes become the measure of progress, you're not watching growth. You're watching an empire rehearse Japan's past. So as Japan teaches us the cost of denial, China's skyline asks the same question in glass and steel. How long can you build before someone notices no one's moving in? Because the true collapse never begins when buildings fall. It begins when belief does.